Now we have the basics of our delete method in place, we're going to look at how we can do our edit and create pages. So just before we get started on this, I'm going to rerun the migrations and seeds on this application so we have a fresh set of data. So over in my terminal, I'm doing a PHP artisan migrate :refresh --seed. And that reruns all our migrations and our seeds so we have a fresh set of data in our database. You can see now we're back down to 10 random users and our pagination's gone because we've only got 10 users in the system. So for our create and edit pages, they're mostly going to be sharing the same form input fields. So we're going to look at a method of including blade partials so that we can write that code once and then use it in both of the create and edit pages. Now we could also create a blade component for this, but there's a good reason why I'm not going to because of how components and includes work. And I'll explain why when we reach that point, why I'm using an include and not a component for this part of the project. The first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to copy the register form over for our create method. So at the moment, if we hit create, we just go to a blank page because we've got nothing in there. So over in our user controller, and that's under app, HTTP controllers, admin user controller, I'm just going to return a view here that I've not created yet, but we'll create that next. We're going to do a return and we want to return a view. And I'm going to put this under admin, like my overview files, and also into the users. I'm going to call it create. And now we need to pass down all of our roles to this create view so the admin can select which roles he wants to give to the user. So let's open up an array here. I'm just going to call roles, and then I'm going to pass down the role model, and I'm going to say get all of the roles. That way in our view, we can now loop over the roles and display them out to the admin. But to save some time on this, because there's no point in us typing it out again, I'm just going to grab our registration form and then copy it over into this create form. So down under the root of our project in resources views, and then we're going to go into the auth folder. I'm just going to copy this register.blade.php file. I'm going to put that under admin. I'm going to paste it into users and I'm going to call that create. So I'm going to do this create form here now in this blade file and get it working. And then we're going to abstract it away into a separate include file so we can reuse it for the edit. Go up here in the title. I'm just going to change this to create new user. And then we're going to post, and the action is going to go to our admin root. So we're going to go to admin users.create. We want to keep our CSRF token in there. And we can leave in the name here. We can also leave the email address. And we're going to leave the password for now. But this may be not best practice, because if the admin has to create the password for the user, then the admin has to send it to the user somehow. It's probably going to be in plain text, and it's probably not best for security. So later in the series, I'll actually be removing this part of the form for the create method, and we'll set up a path for the user. So when an admin manually registers this user, we'll send them an email with a password reset link, and then they can set their own password. But for now, we're just going to leave it in here so the admin can create the password when they create a user. We're not going to be making use of the password confirm field, so I'm just going to get rid of that. And then finally, just to keep our styling consistent, we're going to wrap this form in a card, and we styled that card in one of the earlier videos. So just above the form here, I'm just going to create a div with a class of card, and then just move that closing div tag down to the end of the form here. Let's take a look at this in the browser. Okay, so we now have our create form here, so the admin can put in the name, email address, and the password for the user, but there's no way for them to select the roles. So in our view, we want to loop over all our roles that we passed down from the controller and show them out to the admin in checkboxes. So over in our form, and I'm just going to do this towards the bottom underneath the password section. I'm just going to create another div here, keeping the style consistent, the inputs above, and I'm going to give that a class of MB3. And then inside of here, we're just going to loop over our roles. So I'm going to do a for each, and I'm going to say for each of the roles that we've passed down as role. And then I'm just going to close that off with end for each. Then inside of here, I'm just going to print out each of them roles with a checkbox. So I'm going to do a div here with the class of form check. And then inside of here, we can just create the input for the form. I'm going to give this a class of form check input. And then for the name, and this is the name that we're passing through to the controller, so we can pick this up and insert it into the database. We're going to say roles, and we're going to make this an array. So this is so the admin can pass back multiple roles if they want to apply multiple roles to this user. I'm just going to break this down on a new line to make it easier to read and tab it in. And this is going to be a type of checkbox. We're going to give this a value, and the value is going to be the current role within inside this for each loop and its ID. Now for accessibility purposes, we're going to give this input a ID. I'm going to put this ID equal to the current role and the current role's name. And this is so we can reference this now with the label. So just underneath here, let's create a label. I'm going to give this a class of form check hyphen label. And we're going to say this label is for, and we're going to make it for the ID above here. So we're going to say for role name. And then for the actual label's text, I'm just going to break this down onto a new line here. For the actual text, we can just say role name. That'll just print out each of the checkboxes for the roles, given the value of the ID. And then we'll have a label next to each of the checkboxes with the role's name. And I've just realized up here at the top of the form, I put the wrong route in here. We don't want to go to create route. We want to go to the store route. Now we want to try and submit this form. But firstly, I'm just going to do a die and dump on the request so we can see the data that's coming in. So over in our user controller again, I'm going to come down to the store method. I'm going to do a die and dump, and I'm going to die and dump on the request. Now let's jump over to our browser and submit this form. So I'm just going to register myself. I'm going to give the name of Mark, and I'm going to put in my own email address. And then for password, I'm just going to do password. And then for the roles, I'm going to select multiple roles so we can make sure that array is working. So we can do admin and author. And now let's just submit on this. And we can see the request comes through to that method in the user controller. And if we come under request and parameters, we can see now we're passing in the name and the email address and our password. But also we have an array of roles. So we've selected the role IDs of 1 and 2, which in this system is the admin and author. That's great. We have all the information we need. Now let's just save this to the database. So let's remove this die and dump here now. And we want to create the user. And I'm going to store this in a variable. And this is so I can apply the roles after we've created the user. So I'm just going to create a new variable called user. And this is going to equal a new instance of the user model. I'm going to call create. And then inside of this create method, we just need to pass in our request. And then instead of saying get all, we want to say accept. So we want to get all of the fields coming in from the form except the token and the roles. So let's say accept, and then this takes an array, and we want to say we don't want the token, and that is a CSRF token. And we don't want that because we don't have that column in our table. So it'll throw an error when we try and pass it in. And we also don't want to pass in our roles. And that's because our roles are not stored on our user table. And again, this will cause an error message because it's trying to insert something into a column that doesn't exist. So that's our user created. And the next thing we want to do is apply the roles to our many-to-many relationship. So that's all we need to do to create the user using the data being passed in from the create form. There is a bit of a problem with this. And this is it'll save the password coming in plain text into the database. Now, obviously, we don't want to do that. We want to store a hashed version. There's a feature in Laravel on the models called Mutators. And what Mutators do is they allow you to mutate the state of a given field on the model. So let me show you an example of this, and we'll mutate the password as it comes into the database. So under app, models, user, I'm just going to come down, and then above the roles function here, I'm going to create a new public function. And now the naming of this is important. We want to call it set, and then the name of the column. So it's password. And then after the password, we say attribute. And then this is how Laravel knows this is a mutator, and we want to set the password field. So all we need to do now is just pass in that password. And then inside of here, all we just need to do is set the password attribute on this model. So we can say this attributes, and we want to say the password field for this user model. We want to call Laravel's hash, and we want to say we want to make a hash of the password attribute. What this does now, every time we save on the user model, it's going to alter the password input to this value here. So it's going to do a hash. Now the reverse of this is what we call accessors in Laravel. And what they do, they allow you to modify fields coming out of the database. So I'm not going to be using them now at the moment. Just to let you know, you do have access to accessors as well as mutators. And I'll drop a link in the description to the documentation on how you can use those as well. That's all we need to do to hash that password. And now the next thing we need to do, now we've created that user, is to apply the passed in roles to the newly created user. And just a word of warning here for the hash make method here. Make sure that your IDE has pulled in the hash facade. And if it hasn't, just scroll to the top and make sure that you use Illuminate support facades hash. So back over in our user controller. So now that we actually have that user model, we can say user, and we can call our roles relationship. So if you remember in an earlier video, let's just take a look at this. So over in our project, if we come under app, models, and then open up our user model, if we scroll down to the bottom, we can see here we created a new function called roles where we defined the many-to-many relationship. So we can actually now use this method. So on our user model, and this is the user model of this newly created user, we can say roles. So we want to call our roles relationship, and then we want to sync our roles. There's two methods you can use here. So you can use attach, and attach allows you to pass one ID of a role in. So if you are only applying one role, you could use attach. But because we're allowing users to have multiple roles, we need to call sync. So on the end here, we can pass sync, and then sync allows us to pass in an array. And now if you remember correctly, if we look at our die and dump still in the browser, you can see the roles are coming in as an array already. So that's perfect. We can just simply pass that into sync. So in here, we can call the request, and we want to say, get us that roles array that we passed in from our form. And that's all we need. That'll sync that roles array from the selected checkboxes against that user in the database. And then finally, after we've done that, all we need to do is just return the admin back to the user's index page. So we can say redirect, and we want to redirect to a route, and the route we want to go to its admin users index. So now let's try this out and refresh it in the browser. So let's just hit F5 here, and you can see that has now redirected us back to the users page. And because now we've got more than 10 users, we've got our pagination back. So let's click 2, and there we can see our newly created user in the database. So inside of this edit form, it's going to be pretty much identical to the create form. So to save typing this code out twice, I'm going to be using an include to include part of the form that they both share the same code with. So another method of doing this is creating something called a blade component. And the main and biggest difference between creating an include and a dedicated blade component, an include has access to all the variables on the current page, whereas a component only has access to variables that you manually pass into it. So for our use case, an include is the better option, because that gives us access to all the variables, like the roles and the user, and then any kind of validation errors, which we will be putting on in the next video. So let's just take a look at how we can do this now. So over in the root of our project, I'm going to come down to the resources, views, admin, users folder, and I'm going to create a new folder in here. I'm going to name this one partials. Now you can name this whatever you like, whatever makes most sense to you. You might just want to call it simply includes, but I'm going to go with partials. And then inside of this partials, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this form.blade.php. And again, you can give this whatever name you want. I'm just going to go with form for this. And then inside of here, I'm just going to copy and paste that form we just created from the create view. So over in create, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy everything from the button, and I'm going to go all the way up, and I'm going to copy up to the CSRF token. So I'm just going to cut that now out of my create file. And then over in my form.blade.php file, I'm just going to paste that in here. Now back over in our create.blade.php file, I just need to come inside the form and I just need to say include, and we want to include our admin, and you can see here my ID has filled the path out for me. So we want to include the admin.users.partials.form, and then that includes in here the views, admin, users, partials, and then that form file we just created. Now let's jump over to our browser and take a look at our create page, and it should be exactly the same. So over in the browser, I'm just going to click create, and we can see it's still exactly the same. It's included our form here. So let's create our edit view now. So under views, admin, users, I'm just going to copy the create.blade.php file, and I'm going to paste that in and rename it to edit. Now inside of here, instead of create new user, I'm going to change this to edit user. Then inside of here, instead of posting to the admin users store, we're going to post to the admin users update. And then we also need to tell Laravel that this is going to be a patch request. So inside of the form here, we can do @method, and we want to say the method is a patch. And then we're going to keep the include of our partials form. So inside of our user controller, let's go down to our edit method. And then inside of our edit method, just like our create method, we want to return the view and pass down the roles. So I'm just going to copy that line from the create method here. I'm just going to bring that down. I'm going to paste that into edit. And the only change we need to make here, instead of admin users create, we want to go to admin users edit. So at the moment, this form won't actually work. And this is because we need to pass down the old user information into this edit view. And this is because the form needs to know the user ID that we need to edit. So as well as our roles here, I'm just going to break this down to a new line to make it more readable. And then as well as our roles, we also want to pass down the user that we're trying to edit. And we can say user, and we want to find the first instance where the ID we're passing in matches that user. So now that we're passing this user model down, the last thing we want to do is on our edit form is pass it the user ID. So back over in our edit.blade.php file, in our root here, we're going to admin users update. As an extra parameter here, we just want to pass in the user and their ID. So then when we come to submit this form, it knows what user ID we want to update. So let's just take a look in the browser. So over in our users, if we just click edit on this first user here, we now get our edit user form. And this is using the same partial as the create form. But obviously when we want to edit a user, we need to pre-populate this form with the old data of the user we're trying to edit. So we can actually do that in the partial. So let's open up our form partial again. So for each of our input fields, we want to check whether a user model has been set, because for the create method it obviously isn't. So if there is a user model being passed down, then we want to output that data as the value. If we just scroll along here on the end, we can see already the value is set to the old name. Now I'm just going to break this down onto a new line. And then after here, I want to say if is set, and we want to say if a user model has been passed down, then we know this is an edit form and there's going to be user data in it. And just do an end is set here to close it off. And then inside of here, we want to say if it is set, we want to input the user's name. So let's have a look in the browser how this works. So if we do a refresh here, we can see it's now populated the name of our edit user with the name of the user we're currently editing. So we just need to do the same for the other fields. So I'm just going to copy this as set here. Again, I'm going to come down to the email part. I'm just going to break this value down onto a new line. And then after the old value, I'm going to do an is set user. And if there is a user model being passed down, we want to display out that user's email. Now for the edit, I'm not going to be showing the password field, as we don't want the admins editing users' passwords. If a user wants a new password, they can go through the password reset flow, which is much more secure. We can actually pass variables down to the include and then show parts of the form depending on that input. So let's just take a look at this. So over in our create.blade.php file, and my mistake here, I've just put this in the create view, but we don't want it in the create view. We obviously want that in our edit view. So over in our edit view, we want to make sure we put the patch in there. We're back over in our create view now. We want to pass in a second parameter, and this is an array. So in here, we just want to create a variable called create, and I'm just going to set this to true. So now when we call this partial from the create blade view, we're going to pass in an extra variable that we don't pass in our edit method. See, we don't have any extra variables here. Now in our form partial, we can actually check for the presence of that variable. So we can say is set, and we want to see if the variable create is set, and if it is, then we'll just display out the password field. So if I just do an end is set here now, and let's see how this works in practice. Back over in our application, if we just do a refresh on edit users, you can see we're not setting that create variable, so the password input disappears. But if we go back to our users and we go to create, we are passing in that create variable, so it shows the password input. Now let's go back to our edit and focus on that. So I'm just going to edit the top user. And you can see we're populating the name and the email address, but we're not populating the roles. Let's look at doing that next. So for our roles, just like we did for our name and email, we want to check for the presence of the user model. So inside of the checkbox, I'm just going to break this down to another line again to make it easy to read. And I'm going to say is set, just like we did before. And then if the user model is set, then just let's close this is set off. And then if the user is set, we just want to check the user's roles, and we want to see whether it matches the current role ID here. So what we want to do, we want to check if, and we want to call the native inArray function here. So we want to check if the current role ID that we're looping over inside of our user's roles array that's returned from the database. So we can say user, and then on our user model, we want to get our roles relationship. And then because this is a collection, we want to pluck out the IDs. So we can say pluck, and then we want to say ID. So get the IDs out. And then finally, because it is a collection and this inArray method is expecting array, we want to put on the end to array, and that just converts it into an array. And then let's just scroll along a bit here and then just end that if. We're saying if the current role ID in this loop here is in the array from our user's roles from the database. If it is, we want to mark this checkbox as checked. So I understand that could be a bit to take in, there's quite a lot happening there. So we're just checking whether the user model is set, and it will only be set for the edit form, not the create form. So if there is a user model, we want to go into that user model and we want to pluck all of the IDs on the roles relationship. So this will return us an array of role IDs. And then we're just checking if the current role ID that we're looping over here for the checkbox is in that array. If it is, we're just going to mark it as checked. That's how we check whether the current checkbox has a role that's applied to the user from the database. And you've probably noticed here as well, I've dragged down the quotation marks from the ID. So let's just remove them off the end and put them on the ID again. So our input will now be marked as checked if the user does have that role. So let's have a look in the browser. So if we head over to our users, I'm just going to have a look at this user we created. And remember, we gave them the admin and author role. So we just click edit on this. You can see it's filled in our name and email address like normal, but it's also checked the admin and the author roles. So the final thing we want to do is wire up our controller to listen for this submit button and then update the database. So over in our controller, if we come down to our update method, we can see we're bringing that request in and then also that user ID that we added to our edit.blade.php file. The first thing we want to do in here is get that user. So we can do user and we can set this equal to user and we can say find or fail, and then we just pass it in the ID. So if it can't find a user with that ID, this will fail and it will return a 404 response to the user. So this just protects the application if anyone's trying to do something dodgy and try and delete users that don't exist. And the next thing we want to do, now we have that user model, is update it with our new information. So here we can just say user and we can call the update method on this model. And then we can just pass it in the request. And again, we want to say accept. And this takes an array and we don't want to pass in the token and we don't want to pass in the roles. So I think you might actually be able to get away with just passing all in here, but it's better that we're just explicit and we're saying don't pass in the token or the roles because our database doesn't have it. Then finally, we need to sync our new roles that we've selected in the update onto our many-to-many relationship. So we can say this current user we're updating, we're going to call our roles relationship, and we want to sync on that. And we want to sync the roles that are coming in on this new request. So we want to request the roles. And then finally, once that's updated, we just want to redirect them back to the user's index page. We can say return, redirect, and we can redirect them back to the root of admin.users.index. Now let's try this out in the browser. So for this user, I'm going to take away their admin role. Now let's submit this. You can see it redirects us back to the users page. And if we go into page 2 and click edit, we can see this user now only has the author role. So that has updated successfully. So that's how create and edit pages now working. So we can create new users and assign them roles. And we can also edit existing users and assign them or remove roles. So at the moment, this form doesn't have any kind of validation on it. So in the next video, let's look at some validation. And we'll also look at adding some flash messages. Because at the moment, when you edit, delete or create a user, there's no feedback to the user to actually know whether that's worked or not. Like now, if we just click submit, we're redirected back to the users page, but the user that's done that edit has got no idea whether it was successful or not. So we'll also look at adding in some flash messages. So if you like this, don't forget to hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe so you get future updates. And if you can support me by following me on Twitter, or if you can buy me a coffee on my Patreon, the links are in the description, that'll be much appreciated.